daughter-in-law demanded to speak to the owner about my presence. That was her biggest mistake. The first hint that something was wrong was the silence. Not the gentle, peaceful silence that wraps around an empty house like a blanket, but the tight, hostile silence of strangers occupying a space that isn't theirs, like a breath held too long. I paused at the gate of my own home, an old, lovingly restored heritage house on the outskirts of the city, and noticed unfamiliar cars parked in the driveway. My name, Farah Malik, was still neatly painted on the stone pillar. The bougainvillea I had planted years ago spilled down in violet cascades. Everything looked the same, and yet completely different. I had been gone for 6 months, travelling and healing after losing my husband. My son Adnan had assured me he would look after the place while I was away. He had insisted I take time to grieve on my own. What he hadn't mentioned was that he and his wife, Amna, had turned my home into their personal kingdom. And that day I walked right into the throne room. When I stepped inside, suitcase still in hand, a woman I barely recognized looked me up and down like I was a trespasser and snapped. "Excuse me, who are you and what are you doing in my house? I'd like to speak to the owner." And that right there was her biggest mistake. The house I built. This house wasn't expensive in the way modern mansions are expensive. It wasn't shiny or new or filled with designer labels. It was priceless because every inch of it was built on memory. My husband had carved our initials into the back of the wooden banister. The kitchen still smelled faintly of cardamom and roasted cumin. The garden, oh, the garden, still had the rose bush my mother had planted when Adnan was born. And it was mine. Legally, emotionally, completely. So when Amna walked toward me with clipped steps, arms folded, eyebrows raised in irritation at my intrusion, something inside me turned cold. "Who are you?" she repeated, slower this time as if I might not understand English. I placed my suitcase down gently, brushing imaginary dust from the handle. "I'm Farah," I said calmly, "and I live here." She scoffed, a small, sharp sound. "No, you don't. This is my house. My husband and I live here, and you can't just walk in without knocking." I blinked. Then I laughed. Not mockingly, just incredulously. Because this woman had no idea what kind of storm she had summoned. The sun I raised. Adnan entered the hallway just then, looking pale as a sheet. "Ami," he breathed. "Not Mom. Not Mother." He hadn't called me Ami since he got married, as though the word were a relic of his childhood he'd rather forget. Amna spun around, "You know her." He swallowed, "That's my mother." The silence that followed was almost satisfying. Almost. Because beneath it was a grief I had been carrying for years, the grief of watching my son slowly slip away from me. It hadn't been sudden. It was breadcrumb by breadcrumb, missed calls, excuses, visits that grew shorter, conversations that dried up. And Amna, she had never made an effort to hide the fact that, in her mind, I belonged in the margins of their life. But now the margins had walked through the door. Rewriting history. 5 minutes later we were seated in the living room, my living room, except it didn't look like mine anymore. Gone were my embroidered cushions, replaced by sterile minimalist squares. My husband's old armchair had been moved. The framed wedding picture that used to hang above the fireplace had vanished. "Where are my things?" I asked quietly. Amna crossed her legs and smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. "We renovated, you're welcome." I stared at her. "You renovated without asking me." She shrugged. "Well, Adnan lives here now, and by extension so do I. It only made sense to make it our space." There it was. Our space. Like I was the intruder, like the history of this house could be painted over and erased. Adnan shifted uncomfortably. "Ami, I thought you'd be okay." Without being asked, without being told, my voice was still calm, not raised, not angry. That would come later. "You didn't think that was necessary." His eyes dropped. Amna leaned forward. "So," she said briskly, businesslike, "about earlier. It would really help if you could call before you come over next time. We like a bit of privacy." That was when the last thread snapped. The weight of ownership. I stood. They both looked up at me. "Adnan," I said, "go and bring the house documents." He blinked. "What?" "You heard me." He hesitated, then silently walked to the study. A few minutes later he came back with a dusty folder. I took it, opened it, turned it around, and placed it gently on the table in front of Amna. Her eyes scanned the first page. Registered owner. Farah bint Hamid. She blinked. Then again. And slowly the colour drained from her face. This house, I said quietly, is not yours, it is not ours, it is mine, bought with my money, maintained with my effort, filled with my memories. Adnan cleared his throat, but legally. Yes, I said, voice like steel wrapped in velvet. Legally, morally, emotionally, mine. Amna straightened, masking her embarrassment with anger. Well, we've been living here for months, that gives us rights. Rights, I repeated slowly, do not appear through arrogance, or entitlement, or disrespect. Her jaw tightened. You can't just walk in here and start dictating terms. I smiled, and in that moment it wasn't a soft smile. I already did when I bought this house. The line in the sand. For the next hour things were said. Angry words. Tight defensive sentences. Excuses from Adnan. Accusations from Amna. They accused me of being controlling. I accused them of being disrespectful. At one point, Amna actually said, well, if you wanted to still be part of Adnan's life, you should have remarried instead of hanging on to the past. That one hurt. Deeply. But I didn't let it show. Instead, I made tea. Calm, steady, methodical. And when the cups were placed before them, I spoke. I am not asking you to leave, I said, not today. Relief flickered in my son's eyes. But things are going to change. Amna scoffed, you can't control us. No, I agreed, I can't control you, but I can control what happens in my house. Silence. From now on you will speak to me with respect. You will not erase my presence. My things will be returned. My name will not be spoken with irritation like I am an inconvenience. I turned to Adnan. And you, my son, will remember that before you were a husband you were a child, my child. His eyes glistened. And I continued softly, if that is too difficult you may leave. I will not chase you, I will not beg you. I love you too much to compete for space in your life. Amna laughed bitterly, so this is emotional blackmail. No, I said simply, this is a boundary. The breaking point. They didn't leave that day. But the air changed. Amna became quieter around me, not out of fear, but out of awareness. Awareness that I would not be walked over. Awareness that the house she tried to claim had deeper roots than she realized. One evening, a week later, I overheard them arguing. I didn't marry you to also manage your mother, she snapped. And I didn't marry you to forget her, he replied, surprisingly firm. It was the first time I'd heard him defend me in years. Slowly, gently, reality seeped in. Amna came to me one afternoon while I was pruning roses. I was wrong, she said stiffly, like the words burned. I looked at her. I didn't understand what this house meant to you, she continued, or that you still belong here. I wiped my hands on my shawl. I don't want to be your enemy, I said quietly, but I will never apologize for existing. Something softened in her eyes. We stood there a moment longer. And for the first time, we didn't feel like rivals. We felt like two women, both flawed, both stubborn, both human. Healing old wounds. Over the next months we rebuilt, not just furniture or ownership lines but relationships. Adnan started taking me to my doctor's appointments again. Amna learned how to cook my husband's favorite dish from me. We argued still sometimes, families do. But the disrespect was gone. The erasure was gone. And in its place grew something sturdier. Not perfect, just honest. The day she truly understood. It happened on a rainy evening. The gutters overflowed. The house smelled of wet earth and chai. I was sitting in my husband's old chair when Amna came and sat across from me. No arrogance, no walls. I want you to know something, she said softly. When I first came here I was scared, I thought you'd judge me, I thought I had to fight for space. And now, I asked gently. She smiled faintly. Now I know there was always space, I just refused to see it. I reached over and squeezed her hand. "Fear makes strangers of us all," I said. Her eyes filled. And this time when she called me Ami, the word was not reluctant. It was real. The moral. Respect isn't demanded by volume, it is earned through humility. And boundaries aren't walls to keep people out, they are guardrails that keep relationships safe. Amna's biggest mistake wasn't asking to speak to the owner. It was assuming she already knew who the owner was. Sometimes the greatest lessons begin with arrogance and end with understanding. And sometimes the strongest homes are not the ones with the highest walls, but the ones where everyone inside finally learns to see each other clearly.